Welcome to my dev talk, everybody. It's called How to Write JavaScript Without Going Insane, because it's clearly too late for me. This is really a talk about all of the stuff that I wish I had known when I started writing JavaScript, because it would have saved my sanity, I suppose. So, what is this talk? A collection of practical tips and little code snippets, a mixture of do's, don'ts, and useful tools. This talk is not a pitch for any particular framework or even a suggestion that you should, in fact, write JavaScript, merely that if you do, here is a good idea of how you might go about surviving. So we're just going to get right into it. We're going to talk about objects to start out with. This is the way I was taught to make objects in JavaScript. Can everyone read that all right? So, yeah, sweet. So we have something that kind of resembles a class in Ruby or Python or C# or whatever. We have a person class that has a sayName method, and it has a little bit of internal state, which is the name of the person. And we create a new instance of this object by going new person and passing in the name. And then we can call .sayName on it. This is totally equivalent to that code. And this is more along the lines of how I write code now. So we can just declare objects literally in JavaScript, and then we can just make methods that take in objects and do stuff on them. We don't really need to worry about this notion of talking about this or having methods bound to objects so much. Sometimes we want to have a whole bunch of objects that are of a similar shape, so we can make a function that returns objects for us. This is commonly known as a factory function, but so many people hate the word factory because they like mentally attach it to Java that I just prefer to think about it as a function that returns objects. So you'll notice that in this case, we instantiate our person by just going var person equals person. We don't have to do new person or anything. I know that this might seem kind of weird if you've been taught that all things in JavaScript that start with a capital letter must be functions that are constructors, but this works totally fine. You can program in this style. Now, why do we care about this? Why do I prefer those latter styles so much? What's wrong with the first way of doing things? The answer really comes down to this. This is one of the most confusing parts of JavaScript, and also one of the parts that is most ripe for creating puns. It took me a very long time before I actually understood how this even worked in JavaScript. It's really strange, and I've never seen another language feature that really works like this, but the value of this in a function in JavaScript depends on how the function is called at runtime. So if we have our person, this is very equivalent to what we just had before, and we go person.sayName, it will print out Charlie because that is the name of the person. It's this.name. But if we pull that sayName function off into just a standalone value, which you can do in JavaScript because functions are first-class objects, and you call sayName, we get wat instead. And that's because it's actually defaulting this to be window when we call it without an object to start with. So person.sayName gives us Charlie, sayName just on its own gives us wat. This can be really, really, really confusing. This is one of the cases where I see it all the time. You can pretty much always rewrite your code to avoid using this. In the case of binding something, a jQuery event handler, for example, it's a common pattern in jQuery that all of your event handlers are bound to the events so that you can do like this.preventDefault or this.target. Instead, you can just have the event be passed in as the first argument. jQuery does this for you. Pretty much everything has a style where you can avoid writing this and you can instead pass in the data that you're working with. An example in React, because React is probably one of the more common places you see this nowadays, is that instead of doing the create class style of creating components, you can use a functional component where all of your data is passed in as opposed to being bound to this object. Naming your functions is something that is really, really important, but often goes sort of ignored in JavaScript. Because functions are kind of look like blocks in Ruby. You can just put them literally inline and pass them into a method as an argument. So you see a lot of stuff that is like on-click, function, event. And this is really great until you get an error. And instead of having a useful traceback that has a whole bunch of names for things, you just get anonymous, 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 anonymous. That is really, really, really hard to debug, especially when you're in a debugger looking at a call stack. So what you can do instead is anytime you use the function syntax in JavaScript, you can just put a name on it. Even better, you can declare your function standalone, and then you can just refer to the function value later on. It's just little stuff that helps make your code more readable, understandable, and sort of just cuts out an entire class of potential shooting yourself in the foot. Map, filter, and reduce are your friends. I don't really have code examples for this because I imagine you've all worked with map. Filter is the same as select in Ruby. Reduce is reduce in Ruby, or inject if you're more familiar with that version. Most of the applications I write in JavaScript just use objects, arrays, and then map, filter, reduce. You don't really need too much else, and they're a very sort of constrained set of behavior that lets you do pretty much everything you want in a nice, readable way, but without leading yourself into shoot yourself in the foot territory again. I'm not really going to delve too deeply into this because I think that really the best way to understand... I am strongly of the opinion that classes and inheritance in JavaScript are a really great way to lead yourself into shoot yourself in the foot territory, and also kind of entirely at odds with the most elegant parts of JavaScript, which in my opinion is very much data transformations with functions. I'd recommend that you try using classes and traditional OO styles in JavaScript, because there's no way I can convince you in the next couple of minutes that they are going to cause you an immense amount of pain. So just go try it and get back to me and tell me how much you enjoyed using classes. I think that a huge amount of the reason why people feel uncomfortable when they start writing a lot of JavaScript is because they want to take what they know in existing languages and transfer it. So that's stuff like classes and inheritance and normal forms of sort of like mix-ins and stuff. JavaScript just doesn't really work like that. It is a multi-paradigm language that supports some types of object-oriented programming, but really at its core, it was never designed to support inheritance. And so when you've got stuff like ES6 adding in syntax for a class structure that actually has inheritance, that's all syntactic sugar built on top of prototypical inheritance that doesn't really do you any favors. Window. Some of our developers who have worked on our JavaScript might recognize a pattern like this, where we check, we want to store all of our JavaScript widgets in an object so that we can refer to them in other parts of our code, and so that we don't have to put all of our JavaScript into one file. So it's really common practice to put them onto the window object because it's accessible across all of your different files. This is really, really bad for a couple of reasons. The first one, and kind of the most important, is that window is global state. And by coupling your application to global state, it makes it really, really hard to test, really hard to see where different things are coming from. You can run into some amazing load order problems if you ever decide you're not going to put all of your JavaScript in a single file. Honestly, we're talking about like which request finishes first here is going to cause your code to fail or not. Not very cool. So what do we do instead? Well, the answer is modules. This syntax might be a bit unfamiliar to anyone who hasn't written any Node before, but this is what the old school style of doing modules in Node looks like. So you can write your code, we can have a widget.js, export our widget, no more globals, and inside of our main.js we can require our widget, and we just give it the path to the file we want to require. This works pretty much just the same as require in Ruby, but it's a lot more explicit in JavaScript. You don't often run into the situation where you have everything in your application loaded into one global namespace. Yeah, so it's a lot nicer. It lets us sort of avoid putting global state in, and we can sort of package things up a lot more easily. But that means that somehow we have to actually get that code running in the browser, right? Like require is not defined in the browser. So that's where this little cool tool called Browserify comes in. Browserify is a command line tool that takes in a JavaScript file that has require statements inside of it, figures out all of the code that your project uses, and then bundles it up into one file for you and sort of injects each of them. It solves your problems with global state, with load order. You can do, it adds a compilation step, which is kind of nasty, but also is very valuable in terms of, it means you're not writing code in a global context in your browser, and instead you're writing code in the context of Node in your local environment. That's kind of weird though, right? Like suddenly we're talking about Node and NPM when before we were talking about like front-end JavaScript development. And people keep asking me like, what does Node have to do with front-end JavaScript development? Definitely has nothing to do with Java development. One of the really great benefits of writing code so that it runs on Node is that it means you can run your code without running up a browser, which is really useful if you want to do stuff like run tests without needing to run up Selenium or a headless browser or Phantom.js. It's really nice for running code. Like I've written games before where I've run the same code on the server and the client simultaneously, and that's really nice. It means you don't have to rewrite your application, the parts of your application that you reuse from your server to your client. You can access pretty much every module on NPM with Browserify, and NPM is the largest package manager in the entire world, which is both a really good thing and also a really bad thing. There's a lot of really useful packages on there, but also a lot of trash.
Also got Leftpad.
I can tell you everything you want to know about Leftpad, including how to implement it. Yeah, so it seems kind of strange that you would go to the effort of writing Node code just to use it in the browser, but it does give you access to a whole ecosystem of technology that can really save you a lot of time and frustration. This should really go without saying, but for some reason in the JavaScript community, it does not. Test your code, like write unit tests and integration tests for it. Personally, I use Mocha because it has a very similar syntax to RSpec. It's quite similar to Jasmine, if any of you have used that, except that it runs in the command line locally and doesn't require running up a browser. So we have some really great advantages when it actually comes to writing tests in JavaScript. Because most of the applications you'd be writing in JavaScript, for front end at least, are several steps detached from the most expensive parts of your stack, like your database and your server, you can write lots of unit tests that run incredibly quickly, like we're talking sub 0.1 milliseconds each, which means that you can run all of your tests in the blink of an eye and run them automatically every time you change your code, which gives you a much tighter feedback loop than you're likely to encounter working on like Rails, which is really cool. I feel like it's a waste that we don't write good tests for our JavaScript. We can also split our code into unit tests that just run really quickly on the command line versus integration tests, which run much slower and run a browser, but are a necessary evil if you want to prove that your application works some of the time. ES 2015, also known as ES6. I haven't really touched on this much in this talk, especially because Ben gave a dev talk about it last week. My TLDR for you is that I really like using ES 2015. It has a lot of syntactical niceties that make writing JavaScript a lot more pleasant. You don't need it, though. Like, I'm not advocating in this talk that you start writing ES6, ES 2015 code today, but it's a good option. Not all parts of it are equally awesome, though. Like, I'd say off the top of my head, I really like arrow functions are a nice, terse way to write functions. The import-export syntax is really nice and is also the future of modules in JavaScript. It's going to become, like, it's being implemented in Chrome, I think, in the Canary builds like now, which is pretty cool. So we'll actually have modules in JavaScript native in the browsers, which will be really sweet. Const is really cool as well. It replaces var and lets you declare things such that you cannot change the value of them later. It doesn't mean that your objects are immutable, though. It just means that you can't redefine something, which is nice. The things I don't like about ES 2015, the class syntax is pretty weird. Some of the stuff that didn't quite make it, but is going to land soon, like proxies, are like kind of cool, but also a little bit like, do we really need that? So yeah, have a look at it. Take some of it. It's nice, but you don't need to use it. Speaking of that, this is a really common notion in the JavaScript community. You might not need jQuery. You might not need JavaScript at all. You might just be able to get away with HTML and CSS. You might not need ES 2015 or NPM. You probably don't need a framework. Sometimes you also don't need a server, and sometimes you don't need a database. But you know what? Those things can be really, really helpful some of the time. So try to avoid letting this rhetoric get you down. Sometimes you don't need those tools, but like with any abstraction, they always have a benefit and a cost attached. You don't really need Ruby or C. You could just write assembly if you want. But there's a reason that we use higher level abstractions. They save us a lot of time and effort. Debugging. A lot of this talk has been focused on how to avoid getting into places where things go wrong in JavaScript, but they do eventually. So you've got to know how to get yourself out of that situation. My first piece of advice is to learn to love the Chrome DevTools debugger. Now, this means a lot, because anyone who knows me well knows that I'm a Firefox fanboy. So for me to recommend that you use Google Chrome's DevTools debugger is saying a lot, but There are a few parts of the Firefox DevTools that are nicer, but the Chrome DevTools debugger is far and away the best debugger in existence for JavaScript right now. There are lots of useful features around conditional breakpoints and stuff. The biggest one for me that I think a lot of people don't know about is that you can put the word debugger into your code in the same way that you can do like binding.pry in Ruby, and when it hits that in the interpreter, it will run into a breakpoint, it will stop. But the nice thing is that it only does this if the DevTools are open. So if you want to reproduce a bug where you have to skip through like hitting the breakpoint 10 times, you can put a debugger into your code, leave the console closed, do your stuff, get to the point where you're ready to reproduce it, and then reopen the DevTools and it will hit the breakpoint. It's really nice. You can also just manually go into the DevTools and insert a breakpoint, but yeah, it depends what you're doing. Console.log is the tried and true method of debugging JavaScript. Love it or hate it. Most people hate it. There are a bunch of other really useful console methods, though. One of my favorite ones is console.dir. You can give it an object or an element, and it will print out like a really nice interactive thing into the console that you can click on all of the different properties and look at them. With DOM elements, it actually gives you a little link that you can click that will then show you where the element is positioned in the page, and you can see everything. It's really nice. Console.group and console.groupEnd are also really cool. This screenshot is credit to Dan Abramov, showing how the React internals work. The way that group and groupEnd work is that you can sort of call them at the start or end of a method, and it will create a level of indentation with a label that all of your future console.logs will be placed in. So if you're ever trying to understand a complex piece of code, sprinkle console.groups and console.logs in there, and you'll get a really nice printout of sort of how it flows through the code. Yeah. It's a good idea in Ruby as well if you just want to put some tabs in your logging so that you can get like a nicer, clearer indication of where stuff is actually happening. Libraries. I mentioned that kind of the whole reason we author code on the node side is so that we can access libraries through NPM. There are a cool couple libraries I thought I would mention. The first one is Lodash. Lodash is very comparable to the enumerable module in Ruby. It really fills in some missing functionality that you kind of need to do functional programming. It just saves you implementing some helper methods. The biggest ones I use from it are group by, flatten, zip, and without. There's, I think, another 180 methods in there, most of which you will never need, but if you do, there they are. And it has an implementation of left pad. So there you go.
But no mode.
But no mode. Yeah, Kyle and I had to implement mode because Lodash doesn't have mode apparently. But who needs mode? Moment.js, time is like utterly terrifying in JavaScript. I would recommend avoiding working with the direct browser time APIs as much as possible. If you ever get the chance to hang out with Jakob again, he used to work here, ask him about Safari date bugs when he was working on the Power Organizer. Philip could probably tell you as well. But there are just a whole bunch of terrifying things around time in JavaScript where the behavior differs very significantly between browsers or between versions of browsers. And so I would highly recommend using Moment instead. It's a little abstraction that provides you with a nice active support-esque interface for working with time. It's really easy to use. Check it out. ESLint as well. Some of you may be familiar with JSHint or various other linters for JavaScript. ESLint is kind of the modern fan favorite. It's super fast and super configurable. Most of the old linters have been replaced with configs for ESLint nowadays, but I highly recommend setting up a linter for the work that you do in JavaScript. It's useful both from a code style point of view, but especially JavaScript is a language where you can have a whole bunch of little gotchas that can be really frustrating to debug, and a linter can save you a lot of time up front. Yeah. My conclusion is pretty much that JavaScript works best as a functional programming language, and that in order to avoid insanity, you should recognize that it's a different language than the languages that you've worked with before. It's a multi-paradigm language, and it allows you to do things in a whole bunch of different ways, but there are a couple of ways that tend to be really horrible and a couple of ways that tend to be really great. So try and find the subset of behavior that you like the most and you feel has the least horrible pitfalls, and roll with that. Yeah. Questions? Andrew.
When will you be adding Node and package.json to Rails, our Rails code base?
You can integrate Node and NPM with with Rails quite nicely nowadays. There's a Browserify Rails plugin that works really well. I don't really think that we need it at Powershop because we have such a small amount of JavaScript and so few requirements for dynamic behavior in our web application. So probably not anytime soon. Yeah, but if we could get rid of the prototype, that would be the one thing I would vote for. Yeah. Kyle?
Could you talk a little bit more about the differences between object-oriented and functional programming, and when you want to use a functional language like JavaScript and when you want to use an OO language like Ruby?
Okay, sure. Object-oriented programming gets a really bad rap nowadays, especially from people in the functional programming community, which is really silly because it is very clearly it's the most used paradigm, and a huge amount of business value has been built on top of OO. What it does tend to do, though, is lead you into the sort of situation where you end up with a whole bunch of objects that all talk to each other in such a way that you get a really sort of tightly interlinked network of objects. And there are ways of avoiding that. There's always ways of writing really nice OO code. But I find that functional programming really shines whenever you're working with something that you can view as translating from one set of data to another, which is a very generic way of thinking about things. Yeah, I think that you can really solve pretty much any problem using either, and it's really just around like the style that you prefer. Some languages, if you're working in Ruby, then you should really embrace OO and you should use functional programming on the inside of your classes, but really embrace the notion of communication through messages between objects. Like that's the really interesting and cool part of object-oriented programming, is the notion that objects have conversations and that you kind of have that like Alan Kay small talk style of thinking about data flowing through your application. But functional programming is just a lot more foolproof when it comes to actually doing transformations on data when compared to like the old C style doing like for loops where you're manually tracking the indices, or while loops or whatever. Like Andy puts it well when he says that when programming in Ruby, he pretty much never needs to use indexes because there's always some method that will allow him to perform the transformation he wants without manually keeping track of indexes and arrays or whatever. So yeah. That was a pretty vague answer to that question, but there you go.
Would you recommend NPM or ES 2015 to work on Chrome extensions?
Yes, because Chrome has 98% support for ES 2015, which I think in the next version is going up to 100%. So if you're only targeting Greenfield's browsers, then you can use ES 2015 today without compilation. I would also definitely, it depends whether or not you want to use NPM, and like Browserify depends really on if you want to have any dependencies. I think it's a lot less of a headache to have a package.json which sort of declaratively states what the dependencies of your application and their versions are, rather than sort of like vendoring all of that code into a repo and having to like either download things off of the internet onto your computer like sort of manually, which feels a bit, I don't know, or using CDNs. A lot of people use CDNs to host their JavaScript, which is really great for development until like, I'm not sure how many people are aware, but if you make a website and use anything on a CDN, if you include jQuery on a CDN, nobody in China can use your website at all. Their firewall totally blocks all of our CDNs. So yeah, that's one of the things to consider. But if you're writing a Chrome extension, I would probably just write it in ES 2015 because Chrome supports it out of the box, and you know what you're going to be supporting. You're not potentially going to be running on IE6. So yeah.
So how do you write monads in JavaScript?
I actually do an immense amount of monad programming in JavaScript. There are a whole bunch of really cool libraries for it. For anyone who's not really sure, and I'm not really sure, but thankfully apparently people can only explain monad. Once you understand monads, you can no longer explain them. But I don't understand monads, so I can explain them. Monads are a container for context for a series of operations performed on data. So I do a lot of stream programming in JavaScript using technologies like RxJS and Extreme and CycleJS. So that is pretty much all monad programming. You can encapsulate asynchronous event streams as sort of an object that you can do functional operations on, and you can effectively declare your entire program's dynamic behavior at runtime in a relatively safe way. We're talking JavaScript here, so we're never going to be like Haskell or Elm safety. But yeah, you can totally use monads. I recently wrote an either monad, which because I realized that I often end up in the situation where I have a value that is effectively an enum, where it can either be like A, B, or C, and I want to always handle those cases, and I want to not forget to handle any of those cases, and I also sometimes want to do operations on them. So I just wrote a little function that takes in the possible cases, returns a function that takes in the value, returns an object that has all of the operations you can do, and that is effectively a monad. You just don't tell anyone that it's a monad.
Another specific question, is there any library or framework that will allow you to put out UIs easily, and so you can focus on the JavaScript, like for prototyping or for proof of concepts? Because I've used Bootstrap, for example, just to put together UIs. So sometimes I just want to try an idea and I don't want to focus on the CSS and the HTML. Is there anything that can help you with that?
There's Google's Polymer, which is aimed to sort of like ship a box of web components out of the box that like are dynamic and interactive, and you can just put them into your HTML by like putting them in as an HTML tag. The example is box of cats. Like you can just have an HTML tag that is just a tag that is just a box of cats, and you don't know what's inside of it except that it's a box of cats. I've never used Polymer, and as far as I understand, it's quite complex and works pretty well. There's also React, which was kind of designed for the sake of having a component ecosystem where you could easily sort of drop components into your application and make reusable components. However, there are still a huge number of challenges around, like, if you have a whole bunch of dynamic components that interact, wiring up how they all sort of flow together. So I don't think there's anything really out of the box perfect just yet. You can either use Bootstrap or Foundation or Zurb, which give you the static HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript, or you can go for like Polymer, React, Cycle.js, but then you still have to do a fair amount of writing JavaScript. Yeah. I definitely wouldn't recommend Polymer if you want to avoid going insane. Bonus question?
What's your newest project?
My newest project is also sufficient proof of my insanity.
Nice, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So, this is the README for this talk, which is also the slides for this talk. And I did, in fact, write this talk in JavaScript, because I have gone insane. I can't, Now, this is what the code looks like. So there's some code up the top to do like rendering the view and stuff. But this is what the actual code looks like. So you're asking about monads, Henry? What about flowcharts? So this is a library I wrote the other day called StreamTree. It lets you make a little ASCII diagram that declaratively states how the data in your application flows. So this is the actual source code of my application. This is code that gets run and turned into actual JavaScript. Yeah, this is my latest project. I told you it was too late for me. I have no idea if I like this or not. Like, I don't know how to feel about this, but it's pretty fun to author in, and it actually, like, I don't know, leads to, there's information that is stored in this that is not stored in a normal method of authoring code. Like, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I've written a couple of things using StreamTree, and I'm still really undecided. Sweet. Thanks very much.